Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining our session on workplace discrimination at universities. I'd just like to remind the delegates that you can use the hashtag TEM conference on your Twitter and Facebook. If you're having any sorts of trouble with the session in watching it, just remember you can go back to the red headset in the lobby where there's a live support team. If you have questions, please use the live Q&A button to put your questions in there at the end of the session in watching it. Just remember you can go back to the red headset in the lobby where there's a live support team. If you have questions, please use the live Q&A button to put your questions in there. At the end of the session, we will work on answering those. If there are any questions left over, they'll be provided to the presenters who may wish to then respond to you once their presentation ends. Our presenters today are Margaret Ridley, Discrimination Advisor at Queensland University of Technology. Margaret has worked in the tertiary education sector for over 30 years. Most recently, she has worked in various roles in equity services at QUT, including presenting cultural competence training and as a discrimination advisor. She gives advice to staff and students about discrimination-related complaints. Her qualifications are in law and cultural heritage. Her publications and conference papers are focused on racism. Our second presenter is Gabrielle O'Brien, Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Queensland University of Technology. Gabrielle is an equity practitioner with over 24 years of experience in higher education. She has worked at 3 of Queensland's universities, QUT, Griffith and UQ, in various roles across student and staff equity. Gabrielle is committed to fostering great opportunities for diversity and inclusion in education and employment. She is currently the Manager, Discrimination, Diversity, Inclusion in QUT's Equity Department. Over to our presenters.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gabrielle. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands that we're meeting on today, or the lands that you happen to be on today. QUT especially acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and we recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. I also want to acknowledge any of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today to this conference, and also to those in the QUT community. Margaret and I are in different places today. I'm actually at home. I'm still on Turrbal country, and so is Margaret, but she's in town at the moment. So I'm in charge of technology, which is always a scary thing. So over to you now, Margaret.
No, this is you, Gabby.
Sorry? Oh, this is me. Sorry. There you go. Great start. So just to give you a bit of a context today, we want to talk about workplace discrimination within the university setting. And just to give you an idea, most of you will probably know that Australian universities employ over 140,000 people, and there's more than 60% of them who are women. There's about 1.6 million students enrolled. 58% of them are also women. 28,000 Australian university students are Indigenous, and 250,000 domestic students are born overseas. And we also still, despite COVID, have a significant number of international students either enrolled here onshore as well as offshore. And in 2019, there were over 200,000 overseas students across universities in Australia. So that just gives you an idea of how big a sort of university community that we're talking about. So I'll just hand over to Margaret now. I think this is your slide, Margaret.
Yes, thanks, Gabby. I'm sorry for my head wobbling around a bit. I'm in a really big conference room at the venue that I'm at, so I'll try and remember to look at the camera, but I'm going to have a sneaky look at the slides as we go along. So universities are an incredibly diverse environment in terms of staff and students. So that diversity can be an environment that where discrimination complaints and harassment complaints happen, because it's, when you get a mix of people, sometimes that people are not respectful to one another. So what is discrimination? The Australian discrimination law is a little bit complicated because it's enacted by Commonwealth, state and territory parliaments, and so the Commonwealth has its Sex Discrimination Act, the Race Discrimination Act and the Disability Discrimination Act. And we're here in Queensland, we have the Anti-Discrimination Act, and other states will have equivalent. So there's a kind of overlapping of legislation around discrimination. But the central concepts in relation to those laws are fairly similar, that you need, they prohibit discrimination, so it's illegal, and it has to be, that discrimination has to be against somebody on an identified ground. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it has to be an area of public life, so it's not that stuff that happens in your personal life, and so it's that public life is defined. The tricky thing about discrimination is really that it can be direct, and most of us are familiar with direct discrimination, or it can be indirect. Now, that direct discrimination, I'm sure people have heard maybe racially inappropriate comments between co-workers. There's lots of cases about that that have come to the commissions. Or an example that perhaps might happen on campus is that somebody with an assistant animal isn't allowed into one of the on-campus venues. Indirect discrimination, and Gabby, thanks. Indirect discrimination is a little trickier because it looks like the activities are fair in form. So on the surface, it looks like people are being treated fairly because they're being treated equally, but the outcome is discriminatory. So the classic example that's used was a case from Queensland where a public building was being developed, and the plans showed that the main entrance was only going to be having stairs. So sure, everyone's treated equally. You can get into the building, you can get up the stairs. However, if you had mobility issues, you would have to have gone down a driveway, through a car park and used the goods lift. Now, the Commission in that case found it was indirect discrimination because while it seemed like everyone was being treated fairly, the lack of dignity and the taxation on people with mobility to have to enter the building in that way was a disadvantage and was seen as being discriminatory. So, yeah, indirect discrimination is the one that sort of trips people up. The next slide. Thanks, Gabby. So let's talk about what public life is. You can see the categories up there. The main one, obviously, is education. So that really smacks universities, right away. But we're also a workplace. So we provide goods and services. So discrimination laws apply to those arenas. Public places, QT takes a really broad view of what a public place is, and so it sees its lecture theatres as being public places, but of course it's caught by the education section anyway. And yeah, I'll let you the rest of them. Oh no, back if you could go back.
Sorry.
No. I wanted to just make the point here that in Queensland, sexual harassment is unlawful everywhere. That's not the same across all jurisdictions, and you'd have to have a look at your particular jurisdiction to see whether sexual harassment was limited to those public life areas. I really just wanted to have a quick focus on sexual harassment because it's where Universities Australia and TEXA have really taken a particular interest in the activities of universities. So sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. It doesn't have to be intentional, and it doesn't have to be repeated. So the kinds of behaviour that would be encapsulated in sexual harassment are fondling, kissing, repeated requests for dates, sexual gestures and body movements. One of the areas that workplaces get caught up on is that those displays of sexually graphic material, and hopefully that no longer has happened, but that's been the subject of some of the cases. And sex-based insults, I think, too, and that can amount to sexual harassment. Thanks, Gabby. Do you want to talk about vicarious trauma here, Gabby?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that has come up recently is changes to the Workplace Health and Safety Act. which talks about vicarious trauma for staff who might be receiving disclosures or complaints about sexual assault and sexual harassment. So within each university, you've usually got dedicated staff, such as counselling areas, or in our case, discrimination advisors, medical staff, particular areas like that, who commonly do get disclosures and have a professional framework around them to deal with that in a very professional way, a trauma-informed way, and have the necessary training and background in managing those. But there are also the sorts of disclosures that come to frontline staff, whether they be in an administrative role or a frontline, taking phone calls or inquiries at a counter sort of role, or security staff coming across people who are in distress or in trouble, academic staff. And it's really incumbent now upon universities to make sure that they are supporting their staff from this vicarious trauma. And it's considered another, like a trip and fall or anything like that. Psychosocial risk is now an important part of what health and safety areas within universities have to do. So it's taking a particular note about that.
Right. Okay, thanks, Gabby. We get the next slide. All right, we talked at the beginning about you have to have an attribute to fall foul of discrimination laws, and these are the attributes that the Commonwealth legislation identifies. And I don't think anyone would be really surprised about those attributes. Age goes both ways, obviously, and it's, people can complain about being treated differentially because of their youth as opposed to, the other end of the spectrum. Disability comes up quite frequently in the sorts of complaints that we deal with at QUT, because disability often the complaints relate to that indirect discrimination, and people don't really have a very good understanding of indirect discrimination. One of the ones that's really broad, as you can see down the bottom, is race. So it includes ethnicity and immigrant status. It's quite broad. I'm sure some of you will be aware that in Australia there's been some proposed legislative changes as a response to the Respect at Work report. So some of those changes is that it will be that sexual harassment can be a valid reason for dismissal in an employment context. In my experience of staff being accused of sexual harassment, there's been a kind of, balancing up of risks of unfair dismissal against dealing with, of course the complaint would be dealt with, but sort of it's a balancing exercise around whose rights and responsibilities are going to take precedence. A worker who's sexually harassed at work can get a stop sexual harassment order, which is similar to a stop bullying order, so that's new. The Commonwealth Act is being tightened up about what sexual harassment is and is prohibited under the Act. There seems to be a bit of uncertainty under the Commonwealth Act. It will be extended to paid and unpaid workers, volunteers, interns and self-employed. It's really broad, this coverage about who's protected against acts of sexual harassment. And the time period and the Commonwealth legislation's been increased about bringing complaints. The thing about sexual harassment complaints is that often the complainants aren't ready to make the complaint in the sort of time frames that our policies at universities have. So commonly you'll see that, people need to bring complaints within 6 months. Well, the Commonwealth legislation is pushing that out to 2 years, and I know our policies have a discretion about extending that time frame. Okay, thanks, Gabby.
I'll just make a note. Somebody asked about vaccinations, about indirect and direct discrimination. So there's some really useful information on the Human Rights Commission website, as well as the Queensland, about the issue of, in particular, COVID vaccines. it's a point of, not really a point of contention. There are responsibilities under health and safety to be vaccinated. So there's always going to be pockets of areas where it's a requirement to be vaccinated, and in universities that often includes students going on work integrated learning placements. But it's worth having a read of that information. I'll put the link in the question panel. And Margaret, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
No, it's a difficult area. The key aspect around all discrimination complaints is respectful conversations. So hopefully these conversations about people who have vaccine hesitancy or don't want to have it, that some dignified solution can be found rather than in people being entrenched in their positions. So that's the key aspect of discrimination complaints is that this you have.
Still there, Margaret?
Sorry? Yep. Have I dropped out? Gabby, you might have to keep going. Can you not hear me?
I'm here. Sorry, not sure what happened there.
Can you not hear me? Okay, I've gone.
No, I can hear you now, Mark.
Oh, okay, so I keep going?
Yep, keep going.
Okay, sorry, I thought I dropped out. Okay, so what's the complexity around universities with respect to why are universities different from other areas? So the key aspect about universities is students. That makes the difference. So you can see the permutations of the types of complaints that might arise in universities. Staff versus staff. Usually HR approaches come into play if you've got a staff versus staff discrimination-related complaints, and things like the enterprise bargaining agreement and their Fair Work protections and codes of conduct come into play, as well as anti-discrimination laws. So generally those types of complaints at QUT are handled squarely by HR. The staff against student complaints, in my experience, these have best been resolved through quiet conciliation, through an exchange of viewpoints. So the type of complaint that I've seen is that a staff member was presenting a Zoom conference and there was a homophobic chat going on, so often stuff used as a time for being educative. But the universities obviously have access to their the student misconduct processes, so it's we really have effective ways of dealing with discrimination that is perpetrated by students. Students against staff is the most complicated area of discrimination complaints in universities. Again, most university policies you'll see start with an attempt to resolve things informally through an exchange of perspectives. The key aspect about staff and a student against staff is that sometimes with the student's safety, you need to get HR involved very quickly, particularly in relation to sexual harassment or sexual assault complaints. And then that can delay fast action because you've got to kind of tell the story throughout the institution. But also, if HR commence an investigation about alleged staff misconduct, the student's role in that process is often fraught because they'll be asked to give evidence, but then they kind of often don't get a clear indication of the outcome of that investigation because of concerns about privacy with respect to the staff members. So that's, for me, that's the most complicated area in terms of discrimination at a workplace where the workplace is a university. Student against student, that's pretty straightforward. Often, they're complicated complaints, But the reason I say they're more straightforward is because the university has at its within its resources things like the code of conduct. So it's also quite intimidating both for the complainant and the respondent to have a university engaged in trying to resolve a complaint like this. So often respondents are quite willing, even if they won't admit to the behaviour, if they in fact they have done it, but if they're willing to give undertakings not to have any further contact, and so that's often, in my experience, what complainants want. They want the behaviour to stop, the alleged behaviour to stop, and they want to get undertakings that there'll be no further contact. The university has also in its resources, which is different from other workplaces, things like academic concessions. So students who are complainants, the complaint doesn't need to be resolved necessarily, but they can be offered the support of academic concessions. So that makes a bit of a difference in terms of it being a complicated workplace. Okay, thanks, Gabby. So what are the complexities? I mentioned before that's this coordinating human resources with student services. Often HR departments in universities are not across, well, they certainly can't get access to student records. They're not used to dealing with students, and so there needs to be a bit of an interface between HR and students. This has come up a few times for me, that with work health and safety issues sort of pitted against trying to prevent discrimination, and the key area for me has been in relation to assistance animals. So, and in particular, people training puppies. During COVID, it hasn't been such an issue, but what I found again is that people have some, justifiable concerns about health and safety. People who have assistance animals or training assistance animals need to be respected for trying to increase access and participation for people who might need those animals. Respectful conversations between the parties, the stakeholders, is really been the key, and providing information to people who need it about where animals can go, where they can't go, and also, people who are training puppies being really practical about, even not in being dogmatic about enforcing their rights, being understanding about people's concerns about health and safety. Universities are vicariously liable for their staff who may perpetrate discrimination, and so that's quite a concern in relation to staff training. So, staff really do need to be trained about what indirect discrimination is in particular. One of the key aspects, I'm sure, that everyone's probably aware of is the power differential between staff and students. It gives opportunity, and it really affects the way students feel they can complain, because obviously, there's usually assessment involved. The areas where it's arisen for me have been in relation to off-campus activities often. So things like creative industries or excursions where there's kind of a blurring of lines between staff members and students. And then, the intimacy of higher degree research relationships and what's at stake is also gives the power dynamics there and creates opportunity. I haven't had time this morning, but the case involving James Cook about intellectual freedom was being handed down this morning, but there's another case on foot too. So there's a complicated dynamic between intellectual freedom, the enterprise bargaining agreements and how that's protected, and our codes of conduct. So most university codes of conduct start with a requirement that staff respect each other. Now, language can be discriminatory, obviously, so it's a complicated interplay. I can't say that I have a really good handle on it yet, and I'm waiting anxiously for the other High Court decision to be handed down there. I mentioned before that academic concessions as outcome is a really useful tool universities have for resolving complaints. The fact that we're a highly casualised workforce means that, in my experience, when staff members have been accused, particularly of sexual harassment or sexual assault, they resign and disappear. Casualised staff can say, well, I left QUT because I didn't get enough hours, or there was another opportunity. So you don't end up with findings of fact, and it's kind of the university's in a bit of a bind, really, about, you know, there's no really comeback against that staff member once they've resigned. Another complicating fact, element of discrimination is that we've got a lot of external stakeholders. So we've got TEXA, who set standards, and I know, you know, everyone will be aware of TEXA's really their significant focus on sexual harassment and sexual assault in recent years, and that's been you know, replicated from Universities Australia. So we have to meet standards around complaints management at the universities, which is different from other workplaces. We're also answerable to governments because of government funding, and obviously we're set up often, most universities set up by statute. Thanks, Ben.
So just so we haven't got many minutes left, but just a few quick things, some common things that will happen in workplaces. For example, staff using team chat. You know, we're all now in the COVID world where we're doing a lot of stuff on Zoom and Teams and all sorts of stuff. You know, sometimes the chat can get a little bit off topic, and it's really important to make sure there aren't inappropriate exchanges. We've definitely had examples of people posting offensive memes on chat groups. I noticed one of the questions from one of our listeners, Joshua, talks about the gap between age groups around technologies and the use of things like Zoom and Teams and things like that create some of these gaps. And then you get people saying, oh, well, you're too old to understand this, you know, groovy new platform we've got. You know, all those sorts of things, and you start to isolate staff. Now, Joshua, you asked how you can mitigate these circumstances. I think it comes back to basic respect. So let's respect the more mature staff or the staff that have been at the institution for a really long time, and respect that they have lots of you know, knowledge and skills to bring to the table, and that younger people might have a different set of skills that they bring to the table. So, you know, the opposite can be said too. You know, we start talking about millennials and rolling our eyes and things like that. It's really about creating a respectful environment for everybody that's in. Sure. And then the next ones are about staff members with disabilities and things like that. So people might have some questions in the Q&A about that. But just before we start that, the takeaway messages that we really want you to have from today's session is that, you know, as Margaret said, discrimination in universities is more complex because of the presence of students. Everybody needs to understand their rights and responsibilities, and it does start from a place of respectful conduct and respectful communication. And there's lots of resources that people need to be aware of in their own institution, as well as what's happening in federal and state legislation. So, again, another question from Brian was about how he can support victims with regards to discrimination, and it might not be that it's actually his position in the organisation to do that, but as Margaret said, everybody has a responsibility to support each other, and really it's about recognising issues, responding and referring. If you're not the right person for a student or staff member to go to, make it your business to find out who is the right person and make sure that there's a warm handoff for that person, because they've usually gone through quite a great deal of angst and stress to even make a disclosure. No worries.
Apologies for that. We've run along on it. However, those people that have asked questions, and there's several of them there, we'll pass those on to the presenters for them to reply to you. We'd like to thank the presenters for today's session. We'd also like to thank you as the audience for having joined us. If you return to the timeline to join the next session, which is starting in about 3 minutes, and if you could complete the session survey upon leaving. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Gabby.